The air in Elysian was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere, a substance thick with the scent of old money, white truffles, and the unspoken arrogance of generational power. It tasted of success and smelled of exclusivity. Above, chandeliers dripped light like frozen constellations, their crystalline arms casting a fractured golden glow across tables draped in heavy Belgian linen. The soundscape was a symphony of wealth. The delicate, near-silent clinking of sterling silver against bone china, the hushed murmur of conversations about billion-dollar mergers and offshore accounts, and the distant, almost imperceptible sigh of the city's skyline through triple-paned floor-to-ceiling windows. Here, in this gilded sanctuary perched 57 floors above the grit of New York City, Elena Vance moved with a grace that rendered her invisible. Her simple, impeccably starched black uniform was a stark contrast to the couture gowns and bespoke suits of the clientele, a deliberate camouflage that allowed her to glide through the currents of power, unnoticed and underestimated. To the titans of industry and their consorts, she was just a pair of hands, a functional ghost who refilled their glasses of Chateau Margaux and cleared away the remnants of their feasts. They did not see the mind working behind her placid, professional expression. But Elena was not a ghost. She was a hunter. Her calm exterior was a meticulously constructed fortress, behind which a mind of formidable intellect was running a constant, silent diagnostic of the entire room. Every subtle shift in posture, every fleeting micro-expression, every nervous tick of a waiter was data, logged and analyzed with terrifying precision. Her eidetic memory for operational details was a weapon, but her true power lay in her innate understanding of human behavior. She could see the lie in the slight upturn of a lip that didn't reach the eyes, the discontent in the fractional tightening of a jaw, the guilt in the way a busboy avoided eye contact for a fraction of a second too long. Tonight, she was not just serving canapés, she was scanning for a traitor. A mole, planted by their corporate nemesis, Sterling Enterprises, was somewhere within these walls, leaking proprietary information that threatened to undo everything she and her husband Liam had bled to build. She had chosen this disguise, this position of perceived powerlessness, because she knew the arrogant never look down. They never suspect the person they believe is beneath them, and that was the blind spot she intended to exploit with surgical precision. Her heart beat a slow, steady rhythm, the calm thrum of a predator waiting for its prey to make a fatal mistake. The memory was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. It surfaced at unexpected moments, triggered by the scent of a particular perfume or the confident laugh of a man who had never known failure. It was the memory of a cramped, poorly lit apartment that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The memory of Liam, his face pale and drawn, staring at a stack of final notices on their rickety kitchen table. They had lost everything. Their first company, a brilliant startup built on Liam's vision and her operational genius, had been systematically dismantled by a ruthless campaign of corporate espionage. Doctored financial reports, leaked to the press by an ambitious junior executive at Sterling Enterprises, had shattered their credibility and scared off their investors overnight. The collapse had been swift and brutal, leaving them with nothing but crushing debt and the deep, searing trauma of betrayal. That experience had forged them, hardening their resolve into something unbreakable. They had clawed their way back from the abyss, building a new empire, this time with walls of steel and moats of caution. This restaurant, Elysian, was the crown jewel of that empire, and she would be damned if she let the same vipers poison them again. This hunt was not for revenge. It was for preservation. It was for the hundreds of loyal employees whose livelihoods depended on them. It was a silent promise to the younger, broken version of herself that this time, she would see the enemy coming. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City. But first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below and be sure to subscribe to join our community for more stories where justice is finally served. This is a journey you won't want to miss. A testament to the fact that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. Now, back to the heart of the storm, where the players are taking their positions and the first move in a devastating game of chess is about to be made. The tension in the air is palpable, a low hum of impending conflict that only one person in the room can truly feel, because she is the one who has been preparing for this war for years. Then she arrived. Veronica Sterling did not simply enter Elysian, she conquered it. The heavy glass doors seemed to swing open of their own accord, parting before her, as if bowing to royalty. She was a vision of cruel elegance, dressed in a crimson gown that clung to her frame like a second skin, her dark hair pulled back in a severe chignon that highlighted the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. A cold fire burned in her eyes, a look of bored, predatory entitlement that swept across the room and dismissed everyone in it. The hushed conversations faltered as she passed, a ripple of deference and fear spreading in her wake. The staff stiffened, their professional smiles tightening into masks of wary obedience. Elena felt the shift in the room's energy instantly, a drop in atmospheric pressure that signaled the arrival of a storm. She did not need to see the Sterling family crest on the woman's diamond earrings to know who she was. This was the heiress, the COO of Sterling Enterprises, the living embodiment of the soulless corporate greed that had nearly destroyed her life years ago. A frigid calm settled over Elena, her veins turning to ice as she watched Veronica's calculated path through the restaurant. Veronica's mind was a simple, brutal machine. Her purpose tonight was singular: to secure a meeting with the elusive billionaire Liam Vance, who she knew was dining here. Her father had instructed her to use any means necessary to get close to him, to charm him, to find a weakness in his company's armor as part of their ongoing campaign of sabotage. Seduction was just another tool in her corporate arsenal, as impersonal and effective as a hostile takeover. She scanned the room, her eyes flicking past the faces of the other patrons with utter disinterest. They were merely obstacles, part of the scenery. Her gaze landed on Liam's table, and a thin, predatory smile touched her lips. He was even more handsome in person. Then, her eyes drifted, catching on the waitress serving the table adjacent to his. A perfect pawn. An idea, cruel and brilliant in its simplicity, began to form in her mind. A public spectacle, a small moment of drama, would be the perfect way to command attention, to create an opening. She would manufacture a problem that only she, with her magnanimous display of fabricated concern, could solve, drawing Liam's focus directly to her. The waitress was nothing, an object to be used and discarded in the execution of her strategy. Elena continued her duties, her movements fluid and economical, but her senses were on high alert. She felt Veronica Sterling's gaze on her, and it was not the casual, dismissive glance of a patron. It was the focused, calculating stare of a predator sizing up its prey. She could almost hear the gears turning in the woman's mind. A cold knot formed in her stomach, but her expression remained a perfect mask of serene professionalism. She was at the table next to Liam's, carefully decanting a bottle of wine, when she saw Veronica begin to move. It wasn't a direct approach. It was a winding, deliberate path, a performance for an audience of one. Elena's mind raced, processing the angle of Veronica's approach, the slight, almost imperceptible shift in her weight, the glint in her eyes. It was all wrong. It was a pantomime of carelessness, a manufactured accident waiting to happen. She braced herself, her entire body tensing in anticipation of the impact, her focus narrowing to the woman in the crimson dress. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient sounds of the restaurant fading into a dull roar as the moment of collision became an inevitability. The impact was both jarring and precise. Veronica Sterling's hip connected with Elena's side, a sharp, deliberate thrust disguised as a clumsy stumble. The tray in Elena's hands, laden with crystal flutes of champagne, tilted precariously. For a heart-stopping second, she fought to regain her balance, her muscles screaming in protest, but the laws of physics were unforgiving. The tray crashed to the floor in a devastating explosion of glass and liquid. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. But Veronica wasn't finished. "Oh my goodness! Look what you've done!" she exclaimed, her voice dripping with false concern that was immediately replaced by sharp, theatrical disgust. She leaned in close, ostensibly to inspect the quote to her dress, which was untouched. Her hand, adorned with sharp, manicured nails, shot out and grabbed the fabric of Elena's uniform near the shoulder seam. Then, with a vicious, deliberate tug, she ripped it open. The sound of tearing fabric was shockingly loud in the sudden silence. Cold air hit Elena's skin, a violation that was far more profound than the physical act itself. "Perhaps you should spend less time eavesdropping and more time learning how to walk," Veronica sneered, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables, and most importantly Liam, to hear. "Some people are just not meant for places like this." A universe of fury, cold and silent and absolute, ignited within Elena. The public humiliation, the tearing of her clothes, the condescending words, they were all just noise. What she felt was not shame, but a profound and chilling clarity. In that moment, as she stood there with her uniform torn and the eyes of the city's elite upon her, the past and present collapsed into a single searing point of focus. The face of the arrogant woman before her merged with the faceless corporation that had tried to ruin her. This act of petty cruelty was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of the same disease, the same entitled rot that believed it could chew people up and spit them out without consequence. The memory of Liam's haunted eyes in their tiny apartment flooded her vision, not as a source of pain, but as a wellspring of strength. Her breath did not catch in her throat. It deepened, becoming slow and controlled. Her hands, which should have been trembling, grew perfectly still at her sides. The heat of her anger did not rise to her cheeks in a blush of embarrassment. It solidified in her veins, turning to ice. She slowly lifted her head, and her eyes, clear and unblinking, met Veronica's triumphant smirk not with tears, but with the calm, terrifying focus of a queen about to move her final, decisive piece into place. The game was over. Veronica Sterling just didn't know it yet. The silence that followed the sound of tearing fabric was a physical entity, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the restaurant's ambient symphony of wealth. It was a vacuum into which all sound, all motion, all thought seemed to be pulled. For Elena, this sudden stillness was not uncomfortable. It was a crucible. The cold air on her exposed shoulder was a minor, distant sensation, completely overshadowed by the glacial calm that was spreading from her core outwards, claiming every nerve and every muscle. She did not feel the sting of humiliation or the heat of shame. Instead, she felt an almost serene sense of arrival, as if she had been walking a long, dark road for years and had finally reached its preordained, inevitable end. The woman before her, Veronica Sterling, with her triumphant sneer and her crimson dress, was no longer just a person. She was a symbol, the final arrogant manifestation of an enemy Elena had been fighting in the shadows for nearly a decade. The condescending words, meant to shatter her, acted instead as a key, unlocking a vault deep within her where she kept her resolve, her pain, and her purpose stored under immense pressure. The lock clicked open, and what emerged was not a torrent of rage, but a silent, focused, and utterly unbreakable will. Veronica's face was a mask of smug satisfaction. She had executed her plan perfectly. The scene she had created was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, designed to strip the insignificant waitress of her dignity and position. Veronica, as a woman of such high standing that even a minor inconvenience caused by a clumsy servant was a notable event. She expected tears. She anticipated a flustered, stammering apology. She looked forward to waving a dismissive hand and turning toward the true target of her performance, Liam Vance, expecting to find him amused, perhaps even impressed, by her casual display of power. Her mind was already rehearsing her opening line to him, something charmingly self-deprecating about the perils of navigating a crowded room. She held her pose for a fraction of a second too long, savoring the tableau of her dominance, utterly oblivious to the fact that the woman she had just tried to break was, in that very moment, reforging herself into a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the Sterling Empire. The smile on Veronica's lips was frozen, a perfect picture of hubris captured in the moments before its complete and total annihilation. Elena's eyes lifted slowly, and the change in them was so profound it was almost elemental. A moment ago, they had been the polite, deferential eyes of a service professional, carefully neutral and unobtrusive. Now they were the eyes of a strategist who sees the entire board, of a general who has already anticipated the enemy's every move and has laid a trap 5 steps in advance. There was no fear in them, no anger, only an unnerving, penetrating intelligence that seemed to strip away Veronica's expensive facade, her designer gown, her family name, and see the hollow, desperate ambition beneath. Elena's posture shifted. Her shoulders, which had been slightly rounded in the unobtrusive stance of her role, squared themselves with an almost audible click. She stood taller, her spine straightening into a rod of iron. Her breathing, which should have been ragged with shock, was now slow, deep, and perfectly even, the controlled respiration of a sniper lining up a critical shot. The torn fabric of her uniform no longer looked like a mark of shame. It looked like the tattered banner of a warrior who had just survived the battle's final desperate charge and was now preparing to claim her victory. The entire restaurant held its breath, a captive audience to a drama they did not yet understand. They saw a powerful heiress and a humiliated waitress, but the energy between the two women had shifted, creating a palpable tension that defied their expectations. Then, a new player entered the scene. Liam Vance, who had been observing the entire interaction from his table with a stillness that belied the storm raging within him, pushed back his chair. The sound of its legs scraping against the polished marble floor was like a thunderclap in the silent room. He stood up, his 6'3" frame an imposing silhouette against the glittering city lights. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were not on Veronica. They were locked onto Elena, and in their depths was a universe of concern, of love, and of a shared, burning history that was about to be brought into the light. He began to walk, his steps measured and deliberate, each footfall a drumbeat, marking the final seconds of Veronica Sterling's reign of arrogance. Veronica's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. She saw Liam approaching, and her mind, conditioned by a lifetime of entitlement, immediately assumed he was coming to her. She prepared herself, straightening her dress, ready to receive his attention, to be the center of his world. She watched him move past the table where the champagne had spilled, his path direct and unwavering. But then he kept walking. He walked directly past her, so close that the sleeve of his Tom Ford suit almost brushed her arm. Yet he did not grant her so much as a sideways glance. His complete and utter dismissal was more shocking, more insulting than any verbal rebuke could ever be. It was as if she did not exist, as if she were a piece of furniture, an irrelevant obstacle on his path to what truly mattered. The blood began to drain from her face as she watched him continue, her mind struggling to process a reality it was not equipped to comprehend. The power dynamic she had so carefully constructed was not just shifting, it was being inverted with a speed and finality that left her breathless and terrified. Liam did not stop until he was standing directly in front of Elena. The entire room watched, mesmerized, as the billionaire, one of the most powerful men in the city, stopped before the waitress in the torn uniform. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and in that single, silent gaze, a decade of shared struggle, of loss and rebuilding, of love and unwavering partnership, was communicated. Then, to the collective astonishment of everyone present, he dropped to one knee. He knelt before her on the cold marble floor amidst the shards of broken glass. He reached out, his hands gentle and sure, and began to shrug off his own suit jacket, an exquisitely tailored garment worth more than most people's monthly salaries. The fabric whispered as he moved, and he carefully, tenderly, wrapped the jacket around Elena's shoulders, his movements full of a reverence that was utterly at odds with her supposed station. He covered the torn part of her uniform, shielding her from the prying eyes of the room, an act of profound and public devotion. He rose slowly, his hand moving to cup her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a chaste, comforting peck on the cheek. It was a deep, passionate kiss, a kiss of ownership and defiance, a kiss that left no room for misinterpretation. It was a declaration, a coronation, a public anointing that silenced every last whisper and gasp in the room. The kiss was a story in itself, telling of shared secrets and late nights spent building an empire, of tears shed and victories celebrated, of a bond forged in the fires of adversity that a shallow creature like Veronica Sterling could never even begin to imagine. When he finally pulled away, he kept his arms securely around Elena, helping her stand as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He turned, his body a protective shield in front of hers, and his glacial gaze finally fell upon the pale, trembling form of Veronica Sterling. The air crackled with anticipation, waiting for the words that would bring the axe down. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, cutting through the silence like a shard of ice. "I am not sure who you think you are," he said, each word perfectly enunciated and dripping with a contempt so pure it was almost a physical force. "But you just put your hands on the co-founder and chief operational officer of this entire company." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the full, catastrophic weight of their meaning settle upon Veronica. He then tightened his grip on Elena's shoulder, pulling her even closer to his side. He looked from Veronica's horrified face back to Elena's calm one, a flicker of pride and love in his eyes before turning his focus back to the woman who had just signed her own social and professional death warrant. And more importantly, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "You just assaulted my wife." The two words, "my wife," detonated in the silent room, a shockwave of revelation that sent murmurs of disbelief rippling through the assembled elite. The color, which had been draining from Veronica's face, vanished completely, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. Her perfectly painted red lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her mind was a maelstrom of denial and horror. Wife? Co-founder? The words were nonsensical, impossible. They did not fit into the neat, hierarchical world she inhabited, a world where waitresses were invisible, and power was announced with loud, ostentatious displays of wealth. She looked at Elena, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a servant, but a queen. She saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who knew her own worth down to the marrow of her bones. The realization of her mistake, of its sheer, monumental, and career-ending scale, hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her carefully constructed reality, built on a foundation of arrogance and inherited privilege, was shattering around her, collapsing into a pile of glittering, useless dust. She began to stammer, her voice a pathetic, reedy squeak. I didn't know. I am so sorry. It was an accident." The words were hollow, meaningless apologies offered up to a god she had just finished blaspheming. Liam cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand, the very gesture she herself had used to belittle others countless times. "Your father's pathetic attempts at corporate espionage are as clumsy and transparent as your attempts at social climbing," he declared, his voice rising now, ensuring that every patron, every potential business partner, every gossip columnist in the room could hear him clearly. "You may want to inform him that our internal security team has been tracking your mole for weeks. His little stunt tonight just confirmed everything we already knew." He took a step forward, his presence overwhelming, forcing Veronica to take a stumbling step back. "You are hereby banned, for life, from every hotel, every restaurant, and every property our corporation owns." It wasn't finished. The final blow was yet to come, the one that reached back through time to settle a decade-old score. And regarding your little data leak stunt at Innovate Dynamics 10 years ago, he said, his voice now dangerously soft, we have the proof now. The original server logs, the sworn affidavit from the programmer you bribed. Our legal team will be in touch with your fathers in the morning. A civil suit for $250 million in damages is the least of your worries. We will be recommending federal charges. The words hung in the air, each one a nail being hammered into the coffin of her future. The name of their first company, a name she had buried under years of ruthless ambition, had come back to haunt her. The past she thought was dead and buried had risen from its grave, and it was standing right in front of her, wearing a torn Waitress uniform and a Billionaire's suit jacket. The combination of the public humiliation, the exposure of her corporate crimes, and the utter destruction of her future was too much for her system to handle. The glittering chandeliers above her began to spin, their light fracturing into 1,000 blinding shards. The horrified faces of the other patrons blurred into a swirling vortex of judgment. The sound of Liam's voice echoed in her ears, a death knell for everything she had ever been. A black fog rolled in at the edges of her vision, and her legs, which had been trembling, finally gave out from under her. With a soft, undignified sigh, Veronica Sterling, the ruthless heiress, the corporate titan, collapsed in a dead faint onto the cold, unforgiving marble floor, her crimson dress pooling around her like a stain of blood. The queen of this gilded world had been decisively and publicly dethroned. What was the most satisfying moment of Veronica Sterling's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. The thud of Veronica's body hitting the floor was a punctuation mark, the end of a chapter, but for Elena, it was merely a distraction. While Liam's security team, materializing from the shadows with practiced efficiency, moved to deal with the unconscious woman on the floor, Elena's focus had already shifted. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of observation, had registered a critical piece of data during the confrontation. It was a detail so small, so fleeting, that almost anyone else would have missed it. But Elena missed nothing. While the rest of the room was fixated on Veronica's horrified expression, Elena's eyes had scanned the staff. And she had seen it, a flicker of a smirk on the face of a junior waiter named Daniel, standing near the service station. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smirk of an accomplice, a brief, involuntary expression of satisfaction at seeing his handler create the chaos they had planned. It was the final, confirming piece of behavioral evidence she needed. With the jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, a makeshift cape of justice, Elena detached herself from Liam's side. She moved with a newfound purpose, her steps silent and deliberate as she crossed the floor. The crowd of patrons parted before her, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. They were beginning to understand that the real power in this room was not the man with the famous last name, but the quiet, observant woman they had all overlooked. She walked directly toward the service station, her eyes fixed on the young waiter Daniel. He had wiped the smirk from his face, replacing it with a mask of feigned concern, but his hands were trembling slightly, and a thin sheen of sweat was visible on his forehead. He avoided her gaze, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. He knew, with a dawning, sickening certainty, that he had been seen. Elena stopped in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were soft, almost conversational, yet they carried the chilling finality of a judge's sentence. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm and even. Her eyes met his, and he flinched as if struck. "I saw your data transfers earlier this evening, 3 packets sent to an external server. It took our security analyst less than 5 seconds to trace the IP address. It's registered to a shell corporation owned by Sterling Enterprises. Her eidetic memory for operational details, the secret weapon no one knew she possessed, had just delivered the killing blow. She had not only seen his emotional reaction, she had the hard data to back it up, a perfect fusion of human observation and technological evidence that left him with absolutely nowhere to hide." She continued, her voice never wavering from its quiet, lethal tone. Your little performance tonight, smirking when you thought your boss was winning, was just the confirmation I needed to link the digital trail to a human face. Thank you for making my job so easy." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to one of the security men who had quietly moved to flank the now petrified waiter. The man's face was ashen, his bravado completely gone, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a cornered animal. He opened his mouth to protest, to lie, but the words died in his throat. He knew it was useless. He was not facing a waitress he could intimidate or a manager he could fool. He was facing the architect of the very system he had been sent to destroy, and he had been outplayed from the very beginning. The mole had been identified, isolated, and was about to be surgically removed. The security team was a model of quiet efficiency. One guard gently took Daniel by the arm, his grip firm but not aggressive, and began leading him towards a service exit. Another was already speaking into a wrist communicator, coordinating with the IT department to lock down Daniel's network access and preserve all evidence on his devices. The entire operation was seamless, a testament to the meticulous security protocols Elena herself had designed and implemented. She watched them lead him away, feeling not a sense of triumph but a grim satisfaction. She had protected her company. She had honored the promise she made to herself years ago. She had cut the head off the snake before it had a chance to strike, and she had done it not with brute force, but with intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of her enemy's greatest weakness, their inability to see the power in the people they looked down upon. Liam came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through her own. He said nothing, but his presence was a solid, comforting anchor in the swirling currents of the evening. Together they stood in the center of their restaurant, in the heart of their empire, no longer a billionaire and his undercover wife, but two equal partners, a king and queen surveying their kingdom. The immediate threats had been neutralized. Veronica Sterling was disgraced, her career in ruins. The mole was apprehended, the corporate espionage plot foiled, but the night was not over. The room was still full of witnesses, of clients, of their own loyal staff who had just seen their world turned upside down. This was not just a moment of personal victory, it was a moment of leadership. It was time to address their people, to turn this crisis into a declaration of their values, and to reaffirm the foundations of the empire they had bled to build, together. The initial shock among the patrons was beginning to morph into something else, a buzz of excited, feverish conversation. They had just witnessed a corporate drama more compelling than anything they could watch on a streaming service. They had seen a villain receive her just desserts in the most public and spectacular fashion imaginable. They were not just diners anymore. They were participants in a story that would be repeated in boardrooms and at cocktail parties across the city for weeks to come. The narrative of the night had been irrevocably altered. What had begun as an act of petty humiliation had transformed into a legendary tale of hidden power, unwavering loyalty, and righteous justice. And at the center of it all was Elena Vance, a woman who had just proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the most dangerous person in the room is not always the one who makes the most noise. Elena took a deep breath, the expensive wool of Liam's jacket, a comforting weight on her shoulders. She felt the warmth of his hand, a silent transmission of strength and support. She looked out at the sea of faces staring back at her, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was not a smile of glee or of vengeance. It was the quiet, confident smile of a master strategist who had just executed a flawless checkmate. The game was won. Now it was time to reset the board and remind everyone, friend and foe alike, of the rules by which she played. The second act of her life, the one where she no longer hid in the shadows, was about to begin, and she was ready to take center stage, not as a waitress, but as the formidable leader she had always been. The silence of the room was now a canvas, and she was about to paint her masterpiece. She squeezed Liam's hand, a silent signal. He understood immediately, stepping back slightly to cede the floor to her. This was her victory, her moment. He had played his part, providing the public validation she needed. But the true architect of this triumph was Elena. He watched her with an expression of profound admiration, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with, the brilliant, resilient prodigy who had stood by him through ruin and helped him rise to glory. The patrons and staff leaned in, their attention utterly captivated. They were about to hear from the woman at the center of the storm, the quiet waitress who had just been revealed as the secret queen of New York's most exclusive castle, and they hung on the precipice of her first words, ready for the final act to unfold. The air in Elysian was still thick with the scent of truffles and money, but a new element had been introduced into the atmosphere, the electric tang of raw, undisguised power. It emanated, not from the billionaire who owned the building, but from the woman standing beside him, a woman whose true identity had been the most valuable and most closely guarded secret in the room. Her journey from the shadows into the light was complete. She had weathered the public assault, exposed her enemies, and reclaimed her authority, all without raising her voice or losing her composure. Her calm was her armor, and her intellect was her sword. The battle was over, but the war for her company's soul, a war fought on the principles of dignity and respect, had just been decisively won, setting a new standard for everyone who would ever walk through these doors again. Elena surveyed the room one last time, her gaze sweeping over every table, every employee, every guest. She was no longer just observing, she was commanding. The invisible woman had become the most visible person in the city, her story already beginning to take on the shape of a legend. The transition was complete. The linchpin of the entire operation, the hidden gear that made the whole machine run, had finally revealed herself. And in doing so, she had not just saved her company, she had redefined the very nature of power within the gilded walls of Elysian. It was a power not born of a name or a bank account, but forged in the crucible of hardship and wielded with the quiet, devastating precision of a mind that saw everything. The stage was now hers, and hers alone. The drive home from Elysian was a journey through a different city. The familiar Manhattan skyline, usually a glittering tapestry of ambition and dreams, now seemed like a silent, watchful witness to the night's upheaval. Inside the hushed interior of their Maybach, the scent of expensive leather and polished wood could not mask the lingering ozone smell of conflict. Elena sat beside Liam, the heavy silk lining of his suit jacket, a comforting weight against her skin, a tangible symbol of his unwavering solidarity. Her mind, however, was not at rest. It was a high-performance engine that had just been pushed to its limits, and was now, in the quiet aftermath, beginning a new, more complex series of calculations. The immediate victory felt hollow, an appetizer before the main course. Exposing Veronica Sterling and catching a low-level mole was not justice. It was merely the opening salvo in a war that had been simmering for a decade. A cold, clear purpose was crystallizing within her, sharp as a shard of the champagne flutes that had shattered on the marble floor. It was no longer enough to protect what they had built. She had to dismantle the very machine that had tried to destroy them, piece by agonizing piece, ensuring it could never harm another family again. The memory of their first apartment, of Liam's face, illuminated by the cold blue light of a laptop screen as he watched their life's work disintegrate, was not a ghost tonight. It was a battle standard. Liam's hand found hers in the dim light of the car, his touch a silent question. He knew her better than anyone, knew the gears that were turning behind her calm facade. He saw not a victim recovering from an assault, but a general planning her next campaign. He felt the shift in her, the transition from defense to a calculated, relentless offense. His own anger, a white-hot furnace that had been barely contained in the restaurant, was now banked, simmering in deference to her cold, strategic fire. He had provided the public display of power, the emotional shield she needed in that moment of vulnerability. But he knew the true war would be fought and won in her arena, a battle of information, of psychology, of meticulous, painstaking strategy. He watched a single streetlight flash across her face, illuminating the hard, determined line of her jaw. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had years ago when she had laid out the first business plan for their comeback on their tiny, cluttered coffee table, a blueprint for resurrection drawn from the ashes of their failure. He had trusted her then, and he trusted her now, implicitly and absolutely. He squeezed her hand, a silent vow of support. Whatever she decided, wherever this path led, he would be the sword at her side. The moment they stepped into their penthouse, a serene sanctuary of minimalist design and breathtaking views, the world outside fell away. But the silence within the apartment was not peaceful. It was charged with unspoken intent. Elena walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city that had been both their battlefield and their prize. She saw it not as a collection of buildings, but as a network, a complex web of power, influence, and information. Sterling Enterprises was a cancer within that network, and she was the surgeon preparing to excise it. She finally spoke, her voice quiet, but imbued with an authority that resonated in the vast open space. The $250 million lawsuit isn't enough, Liam. It's just money. They have more. We need to do what they did to us. We need to destroy their credibility, their legacy, their very foundation. We need to make the name Sterling synonymous with fraud. It was a declaration of total war, a promise of systematic annihilation that went far beyond financial restitution. It was about dismantling an ideology of arrogance, of proving that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the consequences of their actions. Liam nodded, his expression grimly resolute. He had been waiting for this, hoping for it. His own desire for retribution had been tempered over the years by the need to rebuild, to protect their new creation. But seeing Elena assaulted, seeing the ghost of their past trauma embodied in Veronica Sterling's sneer, had broken the dam of his restraint. He moved to his desk, a sleek slab of Italian marble, and activated a secure, encrypted communication line. There's only one person who can guide us through a legal minefield this complex, he said, his fingers flying across a holographic interface. Someone who understands not just the letter of the law, but the art of corporate warfare. He keyed in a number, one he hadn't used in years. A face appeared on the screen, that of an older man with sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen the inside of 1,000 boardrooms and courtrooms, and a mane of silver hair that gave him the air of a weary but formidable lion. Arthur Kensington, their former mentor and a retired legend of corporate litigation at Cornell, looked out from the screen, his expression shifting from surprise to intense focus as Liam began to speak, laying out the night's events with cold, precise detail. Arthur listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on Elena as she stood by the window, a solitary, determined figure against the backdrop of the city lights. He had taught her, had recognized the prodigious, once-in-a-generation intellect she possessed for systems and strategy. He had always known she was destined for more than just operational management. He had seen in her the mind of a grandmaster. When Liam finished, Arthur was silent for a long moment, the weight of their request hanging in the digital space between them. Then he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that had once made titans of industry tremble. A lawsuit for past damages is a blunt instrument, Elena. To truly dismantle them, you need to prove a continuous, unbroken pattern of criminal enterprise. The incident with the waiter, Daniel, is your starting point. His testimony is your modern anchor. But you must connect it, irrefutably, to the original sin from 10 years ago. You need the programmer. You need Julian Croft. You don't just need his old affidavit. You need him, in the flesh, willing to testify. The challenge was laid bare, a task of immense difficulty. Finding a man who had gone into hiding a decade ago, a ghost in the system, was a near impossible feat. A new fire ignited in Elena's eyes. This was not a setback. It was a mission, a tangible objective she could sink her teeth into. Finding a ghost was a problem of data, of patterns, of human behavior. It was a puzzle she was uniquely equipped to solve. The hunt for Julian Croft began that night. While Liam's legal team began drafting the initial lawsuit, creating a public smokescreen, Elena descended into the digital catacombs. She repurposed her operational skills, turning the tools she used to optimize restaurant supply chains and manage staff logistics into instruments for a manhunt. She started with the decade-old crumbs of Julian's life. His last known address, his social security number, his college records. She built a psychological profile, cross-referencing his known habits, his academic specialties, his few online forum posts from years ago. She was not looking for the man he was, but for the man he would have become. A man running from a powerful enemy, a man likely living a life of deliberate obscurity, a life that was the polar opposite of his former ambition. She worked for 3 days straight, fueled by black coffee and a cold, burning resolve, sifting through mountains of data, searching for the whisper of a signal in an ocean of digital noise. The first 72 hours were a lesson in frustration. Every lead was a dead end, a digital echo in a long-abandoned server. Julian Croft had vanished as if he had never existed. His family had moved. His old friends claimed to have lost touch years ago. It was a masterful disappearing act, the work of a man who understood technology and knew how to erase his own footprints. Lesser people would have given up, would have delegated the task to private investigators. But for Elena, this was personal. She understood the fear that must have driven Julian into hiding, the same fear she and Liam had once felt. She knew he wouldn't be living a life of luxury. He would be hiding in plain sight, in a place no one would think to look for a once promising software engineer. She abandoned the search for his name and began searching for his habits, his digital signature. She scanned low-level IT job boards in remote, unassuming towns, looking for resumes with specific, anonymized skill sets that matched Julian's unique coding specializations from a decade ago. It was like searching for a single grain of sand on 1,000 beaches, but she was relentless. The breakthrough came at 4 a.m. on the 4th day. It was a single line in a personnel file for a small, struggling library system in a forgotten town in rural Ohio. The employee, listed under the name Mark Peterson, had a resume that was deliberately vague, almost comically so. But in the section describing his technical proficiencies, he had listed a deep knowledge of a specific, obsolete coding language, the very same one he had used to build the software for Innovate Dynamics 10 years ago. It was an old habit, a small, telltale detail of pride he hadn't been able to scrub from his fabricated identity. It was his tell. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a triumphant, frantic rhythm. She had him. She had found her ghost. The feeling was not one of elation, but of a grim, chilling certainty. The first critical piece of her weapon was within reach. Now, she had to face the most difficult part. Convincing a terrified man to confront the monsters that had haunted him for a decade, and in doing so, to face her own. The town in Ohio was a world away from the gilded cage of Elysian. It was a place of peeling paint, quiet streets, and the pervasive, sweet smell of damp earth. It was the perfect place to disappear. Elena drove there herself, in an unassuming rental car, leaving the trappings of her billionaire life behind. She felt more herself in this quiet, unassuming landscape than she had in years. This was the world she had come from, a world of hard work and quiet dignity, the very world the Sterlings held in such contempt. She found Julian, or Mark Peterson as he now called himself, during his lunch break. He was sitting on a park bench, eating a sandwich from a brown paper bag, his shoulders slumped in a posture of perpetual weariness. He looked older than his years, his face etched with a quiet anxiety that never seemed to leave him. He had the haunted look of a man who was always waiting for a past he could not outrun to finally catch up. When Elena sat down beside him on the bench, he didn't even look up at first. assuming she was just another local. She said his real name Julian, and the effect was instantaneous and violent. He flinched as if he'd been struck by lightning, his entire body going rigid. The sandwich fell from his hands. His eyes, wide with a decade of stored-up terror, darted to her face. He saw not a threat, but a woman whose expression was one of profound empathy and shared experience. She didn't make demands. She didn't issue threats. She simply began to talk, her voice low and steady. She told him about the night at the restaurant, about Veronica Sterling's casual cruelty. She told him about the mole, Daniel, and the renewed attempt at espionage. And then, she told him about her and Liam, about how they had rebuilt their lives from the rubble Veronica had left behind. She wasn't asking him to be a hero. She was showing him that he was not alone in his victimhood, that his silence had allowed the same predators to continue their hunt, to continue destroying lives just as they had destroyed his. She was offering him not just a chance at justice, but a chance at redemption, a chance to finally stop running. Julian listened, his initial terror slowly giving way to a cascade of other emotions: shame, regret, and a flicker of long-extinguished anger. He had spent 10 years living in a prison of his own making, a self-imposed exile born of fear. He had convinced himself that his silence was a form of survival, but looking at Elena, at the quiet strength that radiated from her, he realized it had been a form of complicity. She spoke of the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods were now at risk, of the families that would be shattered if Sterling Enterprises succeeded again. She painted a picture not of personal revenge, but of a moral imperative, a duty to stop a force of pure, destructive greed. She wasn't offering him money. She knew that would be an insult. Instead, she offered him something far more valuable: protection. Absolute, ironclad legal and physical protection for him and his family, underwritten by the full weight of her and Liam's considerable resources. She was offering him a way out of the shadows and back into the light. His hands were trembling, but not from fear anymore. They were trembling with the weight of the decision before him. He looked at Elena, at her clear, unwavering gaze, and he saw a reflection of the person he had once wanted to be, before the Sterlings had bought his integrity and then threatened his life. He saw a chance to reclaim a piece of his own soul. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but for the first time in 10 years, it was overshadowed by something else, a spark of courage. He finally met her eyes, and with a voice hoarse from years of disuse in matters of consequence, he gave a single, decisive nod. The ghost had agreed to testify. Elena felt a profound sense of relief wash over her, but it was tinged with the gravity of what she had just done. She had asked a man to walk back into the fire that had nearly consumed him. It was a responsibility she did not take lightly, a promise she would honor with every fiber of her being. The second piece of her weapon was now in place, and it was a living, breathing testament to the human cost of the Sterling Empire's cruelty. With Julian secured and placed under the protection of a private security team at a discreet location, Elena moved to the next phase of her plan. She needed to control the narrative. A legal battle could drag on for years, fought in the sterile, passionless language of court filings. She needed to wage this war in the court of public opinion, where the Sterling name and reputation were most vulnerable. She reached out to Rebecca Ferris, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist known for her tenacity and her deep-seated distrust of corporate power. Rebecca had written a small, largely ignored article about the collapse of Innovate Dynamics a decade ago, one of the few journalists who had suspected foul play but could never find the evidence to prove it. For Rebecca, the story of Innovate Dynamics was a loose thread, a professional regret that had lingered for years. Elena knew that offering her the chance to finally pull that thread would be an irresistible proposition. They met in a place far from the opulence of Elysian, a small, unassuming coffee shop in Brooklyn that smelled of roasted beans and old newsprint. Elena arrived with a single encrypted hard drive. She laid everything out for Rebecca. the original doctored financials from 10 years ago, the server logs from Daniel's espionage, and most importantly, a video deposition from Julian Croft, recorded just hours before, in which he detailed, with gut-wrenching clarity, how Veronica Sterling had personally coerced him into committing fraud and then threatened him into silence. It was a treasure trove of evidence, a perfectly constructed narrative of corporate malfeasance that spanned a decade. Rebecca watched the deposition, her journalistic instincts flaring, her expression hardening with a familiar, righteous anger. She recognized the story of a lifetime when she saw it, a chance not only to expose a corrupt dynasty, but to vindicate her own instincts from years past. "This is more than a story," Rebecca said, her voice hushed with the enormity of what she was seeing. "This is a public execution." She agreed to take the case, to become the validating voice that would lend unimpeachable credibility to their claims. They began to work together, not as source and reporter, but as collaborators in a meticulously planned information campaign. They would not leak the story in drips and drabs. They would detonate it, a single catastrophic exposé published simultaneously across multiple platforms, timed to coincide with the official filing of the lawsuit. They would give Sterling Enterprises no time to react, no opportunity to spin the story or intimidate witnesses. It would be a sudden, overwhelming, and decisive blow designed to shatter their public image beyond repair. While they plotted, the enemy began to stir. Reports trickled in from Liam's security team that Sterling's internal investigators were in a panic, shredding documents and wiping servers. They knew something was coming. They could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet, but they had no idea of the scale of the earthquake that was about to hit. The final days were a blur of intense, focused activity. Elena, Liam, Arthur, and Rebecca formed a tight-knit war council, coordinating every detail of the impending assault. Arthur's legal team finalized the $250 million lawsuit, now fortified with Julian's live testimony and a mountain of new evidence. Rebecca's editors cleared the front page, preparing for the bombshell story. Liam used his influence to quietly line up support from other business leaders who had been burned by the Sterlings over the years, creating a chorus of voices ready to join the condemnation. And at the center of it all was Elena, the quiet, unassuming strategist who had orchestrated every move. She stood in their penthouse office, a large screen in front of her displaying the final dossier, a digital monument to her relentless pursuit of justice. Every piece was in place. Every contingency was planned for. The trap was set. The arrogant titans of Sterling Enterprises, who had dismissed her as an insignificant waitress, were about to discover that they had not just insulted a woman, they had declared war on a queen, and her entire army was now standing at their gates, ready to burn their corrupt kingdom to the ground. The countdown to the final confrontation had begun. The appointed hour arrived not with the crash of a battering ram, but with the subtle, chilling chime of a notification on 1,000 different smartphones. The location was the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, the setting for the annual Sterling Charity Gala, the apex of the New York social calendar. It was Harrison Sterling's temple, the one night a year he could play the benevolent monarch to the city's elite. He stood at the podium, bathed in the warm glow of spotlights, speaking of integrity and corporate responsibility, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. Veronica was at his side, a pale, haunted ghost in a Chanel gown, her presence a mandatory performance of family unity. Then, every phone in the room buzzed in unison. A wave of lights spread across the darkened ballroom as screens lit up, each displaying the headline from Rebecca Ferris's explosive exposé, Sterling Enterprises, a decade of deceit. From corporate espionage to witness tampering, the rot runs deep. The murmur began as a low hum, a confused whisper, and then it grew, swelling into a roar of shock and outrage as the assembled power brokers read the meticulously documented story of their host's crimes. Harrison's voice faltered, his well-rehearsed speech turning to ash in his mouth as he saw the faces in the crowd turn from adoration to accusation. He did not yet understand the source of the disruption, but he could feel the foundations of his world beginning to crack beneath his feet, the carefully constructed facade of his legacy beginning to crumble under the weight of a truth he had buried a decade ago. From the back of the ballroom, a path began to clear. All eyes turned as two figures emerged from the shadows, walking with a calm, unhurried grace into the center of the chaos. It was Liam and Elena Vance. She was no longer wearing a waitress uniform or a borrowed suit jacket. She was dressed in a simple, elegant gown of midnight blue, a color that spoke of quiet depth and infinite power. She wore no extravagant jewels, no ostentatious displays of wealth. Her presence alone was her statement. She did not look at the stunned faces of the guests. Her gaze was fixed, with a laser-like intensity, on Harrison Sterling at the podium. As she walked, the story on the phones continued to unfold, complete with a link to Julian Croft's video deposition. The assembled guests were now watching a ghost from the past describe, in his own trembling voice, how the man on the stage had personally sanctioned the threats against his family. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, a collective realization that they were not just witnessing a scandal, they were witnessing the public execution of an entire dynasty, orchestrated by the very woman the family had tried to erase. Elena's steps were silent on the plush carpet, but to Harrison Sterling, they sounded like the slow, inexorable march of a hangman approaching the gallows, each footfall a hammer blow against the hollow shell of his honor. Elena reached the foot of the stage and stopped. She did not need to climb it. She commanded the room from where she stood. She held a microphone, handed to her by one of Rebecca's associates who had been waiting for this precise moment. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room was now deathly silent, all attention riveted on her. "Good evening, Harrison," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the vast hall. It was the first time she had ever spoken his name, and she did so with the casual authority of an equal. "You might not remember me. My name is Elena Vance. 10 years ago, your company, under the direct supervision of your daughter, Veronica, systematically destroyed my first business. You cost my husband and me everything we had. You did it through lies, through fraud, and through the intimidation of good people like Julian Croft." Her words were not emotional. They were facts, delivered with the cold, surgical precision of an indictment. Harrison Sterling's face, which had been a mask of confusion, was now contorting with dawning, abject horror. He looked from Elena's unyielding face to his daughter's, who was now trembling so violently she had to grip the side of the podium to remain standing. The name, Vance, the company, Innovate Dynamics, it all came crashing back to him, a decade-old crime he thought was long buried, now resurrected to be his undoing. She continued, her gaze unwavering. "For 10 years, you have built your empire on the ruins of other people's dreams. You have preached integrity from stages like this one, while practicing a ruthless and criminal form of capitalism in the shadows. You believed you were untouchable. You believed the people you crushed were insignificant, that they would stay silent forever. Tonight, that silence ends." She gestured to the phones still glowing in the hands of the audience. "The evidence of your crimes, spanning 10 years from the destruction of Innovate Dynamics to the recent attempt to place a corporate spy in my restaurant, is now in the public record. And, as of 5 minutes ago, it is in the hands of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York." As if on cue, the grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 2 men in dark, conservative suits entered, their badges clipped to their belts. They were federal agents, their expressions impassive, their purpose undeniable. They began to make their way through the stunned, parting crowd, their path as direct and inexorable as Elena's had been. The final act of the tragedy was beginning, and the agents of justice had arrived to bring down the curtain. The downfall of the House of Sterling was no longer a matter of public opinion, it was now a matter of federal law. The collapse was total and immediate. Veronica, upon seeing the federal agents, emitted a thin, wretched whimper and finally crumpled to the floor. Her second public faint in as many weeks, a pathetic end to a reign of cruelty. Harrison Sterling stood frozen, a statue of hubris, his face a ghastly shade of gray. The microphone slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the stage with a sharp feedback screech that echoed the shriek of his dying legacy. The agents ascended the stage, flanked him, and spoke in low, serious tones. The flashbulbs of the press, who had been invited by Rebecca Ferris, erupted, a blinding, merciless storm of light, capturing the precise moment a titan was brought to his knees. His entire life, his carefully curated image of power and philanthropy, was incinerated in that single humiliating moment. The screens in the ballroom, which had been displaying the Sterling Charity logo, now switched to a live news feed, showing the stock price of Sterling Enterprises in freefall, a vertical red line plunging into an abyss from which it would never recover. Elena watched it all, her expression unreadable. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a profound and solemn sense of closure. The ghosts of the past had been faced. The debt had been paid. Justice, cold and absolute, had finally been served. The months that followed were a quiet revolution. The Sterling Empire was dismantled by federal prosecutors and bankruptcy courts. The $250 million settlement from their civil suit was the first claim paid. But Elena and Liam did not absorb the money into their own company. Instead, Elena established the Innovate Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support to small business owners and whistleblowers targeted by predatory corporate practices. She used the money that had been stolen from her to build a shield for others, transforming her personal victory into a public good. She personally oversaw the foundation, bringing the same meticulous strategy and deep empathy to her philanthropy that she had brought to her business. She met with every person the foundation helped, listening to their stories, seeing the same fear and determination in their eyes that had once been in her own. Her motivation had never been revenge. It had been the restoration of balance, the belief that the powerful had a duty to protect, not to crush, the vulnerable. She was honoring the memory of the two young, broken entrepreneurs they had once been, ensuring that no one else would have to suffer the way they had. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elena drove back to Ohio. She found Julian Croft not in a dreary library, but in the front yard of a new house, tossing a baseball with his son. He was no longer Mark Peterson, the man in hiding. He was Julian again, his name cleared, his future secure. The haunted, anxious look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He saw her car and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. He thanked her, his voice thick with an emotion that needed no further words. They didn't speak of the Sterlings or the trial. They spoke of his son's school, of his wife's new garden, of the simple, beautiful life he had reclaimed. As she drove away, Elena felt a sense of completion that the fall of Harrison Sterling could never provide. This was the true measure of her success, not in the destruction of her enemy, but in the rebuilding of a life her enemy had broken. It was the final, quiet affirmation that her long, arduous journey had been about justice in its purest form, the kind that heals and restores rather than simply punishes. Back in New York, she stood once more by the windows of Elysian. It was late, the last of the diners had gone, and the restaurant was quiet, filled with the peaceful hum of a well-oiled machine. She was no longer in disguise, but was known to her staff as the brilliant, demanding, but deeply fair leader she was. She had promoted the hostess who had rushed to her aid that fateful night to the position of general manager, rewarding loyalty and character above all else. She looked down at the glittering city, no longer a battlefield, but a kingdom she had fought for and won. Liam came to stand beside her, wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting on her head. They stood in comfortable silence, two partners who had been through the fire and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. She was not just a survivor. She was a creator, a protector, a queen who had built her castle not on a foundation of inherited wealth, but on the bedrock of resilience, intelligence, and an unshakable belief that true power is not about how high you can climb, but how many people you lift up with you. The quiet waitress had not just won a war, she had redefined the terms of victory. If Elena Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.